thought the waters would stay the same, deep, predictable, governed by charts and tradition. Instead, the sea learned to lie. After the first successful strikes, the Sea Baby program stopped being an experiment and started to look like an entire new class of warfare. Swarms were no longer a tactic on paper. They were a nightly routine. Dozens would launch from hidden coves along the Ukrainian coast, spread out like hungry schools of fish, then converge on a single swollen target, an anchored landing ship, a supply barge, a fuel depot. Some were tiny and fast, designed to ram and detonate. Others carried shaped charges, magnetically attached to hulls and detonated remotely. A few were scouts, eyes that streamed high-definition video back to command nodes buried under farmhouse cellars. The Black Sea Fleet adapted. It had to. Convoys moved under the cover of electronic jammers and smoke. Ships hugged the coastline, hoping geography would shield them. They began to rely on layered defenses, short-range anti-drone nets, rapid-fire autocannons, drone hunter helicopters that sprayed flares and tiny shotgun-like nets. But the Sea Babies kept changing. New firmware rolled out overnight. AI models learned the patterns of Russian radar, then learned to fly through the gaps. A Sea Baby might pretend to be a fishing boat on radar, then flatten its profile at the last second and sprint. Behind this technological chess game were the engineers and the operators, the human thread that tied cold code to fiery result. In a concealed hangar near Odessa, a team of software developers hunched over monitors, watching camera feeds from machines 100 miles away. Their leader was not a general, but a former Marine engineer, with a love for hardware and an obsession with elegant code. He had built a simulation rig that could mimic every possible response the Russians could throw at a drone. When the simulations failed, he slept on the floor and rewrote the algorithms until they passed. On the other side, the Admiralty's analysts tried to map the psychology of an enemy who would willingly hand over life-and-death choices to lines of code. They held war games where political officers argued strategy, while technicians argued feasibility. One senior officer, a man whose face had become a map of old seas and older defeats, quietly told a young lieutenant, "We cannot fight machines with ships alone. We must make the machine's mind uncomfortable." It was a confession and a plan. Jam their comms, flood their sensors, attack their supply lines, but most of all, find the hands that made them. So intelligence operations intensified. Spies, hackers, and saboteurs moved in a shadow network. Undersea cables became prize targets. A coastal workshop suspected of 3D printing hull components suddenly burned down in an explosion that some said was an accident and others called a precision strike. Anonymous messages and false flag broadcasts seeded mistrust among the drone crews. A pilot sitting at a console in a damp basement got a call in the middle of the night. A voice, calm and British accented, warned him that their GPS updates were polluted. The pilot didn't know whether to trust it. He changed the route anyway. That precaution saved 2 Sea Babies from a trap the next day. The propaganda war mirrored the kinetic one. Videos of Sea Babies slipping under the noses of Russian destroyers spread across social feeds, framed as proof of genius and resilience. Russian outlets countered with footage of a Sea Baby exploding on the water after being intercepted, paired with commentary about invincible naval power. Internationally, the headlines split into camps. One praised asymmetric innovation, the other warned of a destabilizing precedent. Weapons that could be mass-produced in garages, launched with modest budgets, and used with plausible deniability. NATO watched closely, calculating strategic implications. A senior analyst briefed envoys in Brussels. What Ukraine shows us is not merely a tactic, but a multiplier. For middle powers with technical know-how, the sea is now accessible in a way that defies classical naval doctrine. For nations with long coastlines and limited budgets, this sounded like a revolution. For established naval powers, it sounded like a new headache, one that made every port vulnerable and every merchant route suspect. On the front lines, the human cost slowly accumulated. Sailors who had spent their lives at sea found themselves working odd watches for threats that were invisible until impact. Merchant crews hesitated to load certain cargoes. Insurance premiums for Black Sea passages doubled. Ports shuttered in the middle of the night. Fishermen, the unwitting sentries of the deep, sometimes found pieces of broken drones in their nets and wondered whether their day's catch had paid for a strike. Families of the drone operators lived with a strange intimacy to death. They cheered when a sea baby made headlines and grieved when a team member didn't come home because a retaliatory missile had found his garage. The Russians doubled down on doctrine and engineering. They experimented with decoy fleets, inexpensive hulks that mimicked signals of high-value targets to drain the Ukrainians' stock of sea babies. They refined AI hunting protocols and hired cyber contractors to chase command and control nodes across dark web markets. In some cases, they succeeded. A Russian cyber raid severed communications to a cluster of sea babies on a cold morning. The autonomous routines took them in ever-widening circles until they ran out of fuel and sank. It was a victory headline, and also, paradoxically, a lesson. Autonomy without redundancy could be brittle. Ukraine responded not by retreating, but by decentralizing. Control became less, not central command, but a distributed mesh. Algorithms were replaced with mission-agnostic directives. When comms failed, sea babies shifted into pre-agreed behavior sets. One wave of drones would act as shepherds, corralling enemy sensors into traps. Another would be the strike element. They borrowed from biology as much as from engineering, emergent swarm behaviors that had no single point of failure. Then, as the autumn sea fog rolled in, a new twist. Commercial satellites, private night vision companies, and open-source enthusiasts began to add data to the theater. A hobbyist high above the sea posted a thermal clip of a sea baby launching from a secluded inlet. Within hours, analysts in multiple capitals had markers on a map. The contest had become a crowded bazaar of information, and with more eyes came more accidental disclosure. Ukraine's team started limiting public streams, moving conversations to encrypted pockets, and running mock campaigns designed to mislead anyone watching. In port cities, entrepreneurs saw opportunity. Workshops once making kitchen tools pivoted to produce propeller guards and watertight electronics boxes. Universities ran accelerated courses in autonomous systems. Investors whispered about patents and the post-war market for maritime drones. It was a strange economy. War fueling innovation, innovation seeding more war, and everyone in the chain knew their work might outlast the conflict. As the winter set in, the Black Sea no longer felt like a single battlefield. It had become a layered frontier where sovereignty blurred. Autonomous machines kept crossing invisible lines, and international law struggled to keep pace. Who owned an unmanned vessel that drifted into another nation's waters? Who fired first when a sea baby detonated under a neutral flag? These questions were argued in quiet rooms far from the waves, but their answers would shape future treaties. And yet, for all the strategy, for all the circuitry and code, the decisive moments remained stubbornly human. A radar operator, tired and hungry, failed to relay a contact. An engineer scrawled a note on a whiteboard, a tweak that prevented a guidance loop from repeating. And a sea baby suddenly found its target with uncanny precision. In the end, the machines were tools shaped by choices, fears, and creativity. One night, under a sky thick with low clouds, a dozen sea babies launched toward a convoy that had been sheltering near a rocky promontory. The convoy sent up flares and turned as one. The sea babies split, feinting left, then right, until the defenders' patterns broke. In the confusion, two drones slipped through and struck a fuel tender. The explosion lit the waves like a second dawn. From the command bunker, the engineer watching the feed did not celebrate. He closed his laptop, removed his headset, and looked out across a map of the sea. He knew this was a victory, small, tactical, and also a pivot. The rules had changed, and now every navy, every government, every engineer would have to decide what to build next and who would control it. Above the
has
black
complete
water,
freedom of maneuver
the
in the
night
Black
swallowed
Sea
the
and
smoke.
rules the Black Sea.
The sea
And that
babies,
is
as if
directly
obedient
through
to a
these
different kind of
autonomous
tide,
drones. So I think
continued to
that is
glide
why
home.
it is
The Black
so
Sea had been
significant.
altered not by a
And the
single
development
battle,
we're seeing
but
at the
by a
moment
fundamental
is at a
shift.
phenomenal rate.
A theater where
The first
autonomy,
naval drones we
ingenuity,
saw
and human
were,
will combined to redraw the
Sea Baby
outlines of
Mark 1 or
power.
whatever it was.
And
Drones
while
that
the
could
horizon
travel,
offered no
a couple
immediate
hundred
peace,
kilometers
it
with quite a
promised
big
one
payload,
certainty.
but they were full
The
of
sea
explosives.
would never again
They
be
basically
simply
hit
a
Russian
place to
ships and
sail.
blew up and destroyed those Russian ships.